Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Digital Culture speaker series. It's my great honor today to introduce you to Sarah Belle Reid. Sarah is a composer and an extraordinary performer on trumpet, modular synthesizers, and she writes an ever-growing collection of handcrafted electronic instruments, which I think is a penchant that many of us in digital culture share. And that's something that she will talk about today. Sarah has a unique musical voice, as you can hear, that intersects between contemporary classical music, experimental and interactive electronics, visual arts, noise music, and improvisation. Sounds like a real contemporary practice. Her critics have praised her ability to take audiences on vivid sonic adventures and described her music as graceful, as danceable, and I love this one, as silk falling through space. I would love to get that review. Sarah's debut album for trumpet and live interactive electronics was released in October 2019. And her horn is augmented by a whole range of electronic sensors and interfaces, which she calls MIGSI, which I guess we'll hear something about today. Sequenza in their review wrote that Reid has greatly extended the possibilities of the humble trumpet into new territory by applications of innovative sensing technology and sound processing. And truly, it's an extraordinary performance to see. And here, of course. Sarah's led performances, workshops and lectures and so on at Moogfest, at Stanford, at NIME, and many other institutions. She holds a doctorate of musical arts from California Institute of the Arts and currently teaches at Chapman University in Orange County in California and Temple University in Philadelphia. You probably also know Sarah's extraordinary YouTube channel and social media streams, where I think she takes on a unique and highly commendable approach to sharing the teaching of music and technology through open access and media channels and online mentoring. She's here today in part because we've commissioned Sarah to write a work for the new Fifth Order Ambisonic Dome here at AME. Which is an exciting adventure for all of us. And she will be here in person probably in April. She was supposed to be here now, but unfortunately is literally frozen in place in the middle of America, unable to get a plane to even start for her. So without further ado, her title of her talk today is Co-Creation in Electroacoustic Instruments, Composition and Performance. And Sarah will give her talk, and then we'll be absolutely delighted to take questions at the end. So please welcome Sarah Belle Reid.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all so much for being here and, for inviting me to come and speak today. As Garth mentioned, the plan was for me to be there in person, and after 6 or 7 canceled flights and rescheduled flights, we had to come to the difficult decision that it just wasn't going to happen for this time of the month. But I will be back. I will be there in April, hopefully, and I'm really looking forward to meeting all of you in person and spending some time working in the Dome. Much to look forward to there. So anyway, at least we're able to connect online this way. So I'm just going to share my screen here to get started. Yeah, so I guess with that really great introduction out of the way, I can skip my first couple slides, which is awesome. You now know all of this. This is me surrounded by a bunch of my favorite things. Flugelhorn, a modular synthesizer, my computer, some other things that I like very much and spend a lot of time with. So based on the title of this talk, it's called Co-Creation in Electroacoustic Instruments, performance, and composition. So I wanted to start off by defining at least what I mean when I'm using the word co-creation, because this can mean a lot of things. And, you all might, given that you're in this digital culture world, you might have similar initial thoughts as what I do. But many people think co-creation is like a collaboration between different people, or maybe audience participation in a piece, something like that. Really, what I'm focused on and fascinated by in terms of co-creation is this aspect of human-machine co-creation. And an extension of that is machine environment or system environment co-creation. And that's a little different from just interaction, I think, because it's multi-directional. So I can feed something into the instrument and it will respond to me and give me back something that might align with what I provided it, or it might not. It might surprise me. It might be a little bit unpredictable. It might push me in a new direction. And we are, we being me and my instrument, or me in this performance environment, or this code system, or this patch on my synth, we are creating something together. So this idea, I think, really started to swirl in my brain when I was reading an interview in Polyphony magazine. This was from the 1960s, I think, with Don Buchla. Don Buchla, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, is a very important early pioneer and one of the early inventors of the analog modular synthesizer in the 1960s. And I was just getting interested in the world of electronic and electroacoustic music. And prior to that, I was a classically trained acoustic trumpet player. And that was my whole world. That was my whole kind of way of knowing and interacting with sound, was through the trumpet. And so my relationship with my instrument, and I wonder if, there's any acoustic instrumentalists in the group, you might be able to relate to this. My relationship with my trumpet was very much about me having command over this instrument, right? I was focused on mastering the instrument, being able to think of something I wanted to play and execute it as closely to flawlessly as possible. Of course, that was constantly something I was working on, but it was really about that kind of one directional relationship. And then I was reading this interview with Don Buchla, and he was talking about this incredible opportunity that we have with electronic instruments because of the total independence between input and output. And so I found this really, really striking. So, a trumpet player, for example, you buzz into a mouthpiece, or you blow air through the mouthpiece, and that's your input structure, right? That air goes through the tubes and it comes out eventually of the bell at the end, and that amplifies the sound, and that's our output structure, I suppose. You can also interact with it by pushing down the piston valves. That changes the length of the tubing, which results in a change of pitch and also a change in timbre, depending on how you are manipulating them. So you can interact with the instrument in a couple of ways, but all of these aspects of it are inherently connected together because it's in this acoustic instrument form. And if you think of a violin, or drums or something like that, we really have the input and the output, and they're connected together. With electronic instruments, though, what Don Buchla was talking about is that connection, that necessary connection, does not exist, or does not have to exist. You can give your instrument, one input gesture, for example, whatever that might be, a button press or a articulation or a pluck or anything, and it can give you one thing right away, or it can give you 5 things right away, right? It can give you 5 things that happen in sequence. It can give you 5 things that happen randomly over random intervals of time between immediate and forever in the future, 5 minutes in the future, whatever. So we have this really exciting kind of relationship in that way. And I always found that fascinating. So that's the first thing I wanted to share. The second thing is about this David Tudor quote that I have down at the bottom of the slide, which is, the object should teach you what it wants to hear. So when I first read this was an interview with David Tudor. And at the moment, I'm actually forgetting the source, regrettably, but he was referring to some of the objects that were part of one of his pieces, Rainforest 4. And he was talking, instead of the listener having control or the performer having control over these instruments, telling them what to do, or even activating them in a traditional way, that really the relationship was more about the object teaching you what it wants to hear. And this was so backwards from any way that I had ever, thought of an instrument. And it really, this idea of an instrument being more like an ecosystem, more like something that you participate in, you interact with, but it has the ability to teach you and to listen to you and to nudge you. This, coupled with the idea of an independence between input and output, really has been kind of the fuel to my creative fire, so to speak, over the last decade or so. So that's where I'm coming from when I'm talking about co-creation. I hope that makes sense. So what my plan is for this talk is to share a little bit about some of my recent creative research and some of my work, and also a little bit about just my general approach to composition. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I have been experimenting and doing some early creative research for this dome commission, the Fifth Order Ambisonic Dome. And we'll see where the discussion goes from there, I guess, but that's the initial plan anyhow. Okay. So here we go. The first thing that I want to talk to you about is called MIGSI. Garth mentioned this briefly in the introduction. This is, you can see in the top right picture. MIGSI stands for Minimally Invasive Gesture Sensing Interface, and this is a sensor-based interface that attaches onto a regular acoustic trumpet. And it basically has a collection of different sensors. You can see those down in the bottom right corner. Some optical sensors that detect valve displacement, some pressure sensors that detect the pressure of my left hand on the horn, an accelerometer that detects movement of the trumpet. And so MIGSI itself doesn't create or produce any sound, but it just collects this performance and this gestural information from both me and from the horn as I'm playing it. And then at that point, it's sent over to a computer and it can be parsed and scaled in about infinite number of ways. And that's really where things start to kind of get interesting. You can, convert it into control voltage and send it over to a modular synthesizer, or keep it within your computer and send it into Macs or really anything. So I'm just going to open up a video here. I'm going to stop my screen and restart my screen sharing to show you a little bit of video and sound of a recent piece using MIGSI. So in this piece, let me just get this queued up here. Okay. So in this piece, I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on. MIGSI is kind of acting as the central control source, I suppose, for all the sound that you're seeing and generally for the environment of the piece. There are light bulbs suspended around the room, above the audience, behind the audience, and they are receiving trigger sources from the trumpet, from different valve movements and things like that. There's a couple modular synthesizers on the table behind me and on the floor over here. Those are receiving control voltage information from the trumpet. My laptop is processing, there's a Maximus P patch, it's processing the sound of my trumpet and also generating some new chaotic sound as well. So there's a lot going on, and all of the information in some way is being derived from the sensors. But what makes this, in my opinion, an exploration in this co-creative sense is that I'm basically improvising in this kind of world that I've set up. And sometimes when I make a gesture, I get an immediate response that's very obviously linked. And other times I don't. Other times the data gets captured and maybe held on to for 5 to 10 seconds or 5 minutes even sometimes, and circulates back in the performance a long time later. So I'm just going to play some of this. I'm going to jump around a little bit just to give you a feel for things.
You're muted, Sarah.
Thanks. So that is MIGSI. There's been, probably about 6 dozen projects using MIGSI that have emerged over the last few years, but that is a recent one that I think kind of sums things up in a nice way. Oh, sorry, hang on, I'm having some trouble here. You're seeing my slides, right? Okay. Okay, so I want to jump to a different piece that kind of explores this idea of co-creation in a slightly different way. This piece is called Timepiece. And what I was really interested in working with in this work was the idea of composing for spaces, which of course is very relevant when we're talking, about an ambisonic dome, which is quite a large space. And I was really interested here in composing for very small spaces, and for particularly about the idea of networking multiple spaces together, little acoustic spaces together. So if you can see behind me in this photo on the left, there's a garbage can hanging from some poles, and there's a garbage can lid, a metal sheet. Not shown in this photo is a kind of deconstructed glockenspiel with all of the keys hanging and a couple other metal sheets. And they were all wired up as essentially as the loudspeakers in the hall surrounding the audience. So we were using these as our loudspeakers instead of traditional speakers. So they had surface transducers on them, and they also had contact microphones on them. So they were both resonators and microphones in a sense. They were cross-wired with one another. So the input of one would go to the output of another, and so on. Which of course would, in the right circumstances, would start to generate feedback between them. What was really fascinating about this to me was that depending on the sound material you would put into them, it would not only take on the characteristic of the object that was being the resonator, like the garbage can, which sounded fantastic, by the way. They would also start to ring and kind of spring to life, depending on certain really good frequencies that you could send into it they would be really responsive to. Migsy was also involved, so was that same surge modular synthesizer, and all of the sound here was being kind of panned around and spatialized between these different objects. So you'd get to hear the same sound going from, garbage can to metal sheet to broken glockenspiel to, large metal plate and so on. So I'm just going to share a brief, like a minute of this for the sake of time. I'm going to jump in here. Okay. Okay, so in the first piece that I shared, I was creating a kind of interaction environment that I had some ability to control, but it was very unpredictable, right? So I would give it some sound, some input, and the light bulbs would respond back to me, and Migsy would respond back to me in some way. And that was kind of what was fueling and keeping the, causing the evolution in the performance. And similarly in the second piece, although they were pretty different in form. It's the same kind of idea. I was creating this literally unstable environment with this feedback kind of network of objects, and then sending sound into it and letting the objects kind of explode and burst into their own feedback. And then, of course, when one would start to ring, because they were all cross linked, it would cause another one to sympathetically start to resonate and ring. And it was really quite interesting and quite beautiful. So, yeah. The last thing I wanted to share in this realm is this piece. This is a really similar idea. It's just kind of an elaboration or extension on the last piece. This idea of feedback is something that I've become really, really fascinated with as a form of co-creation. Audio feedback and also just data feedback. So the idea of, giving a system or giving an instrument an input gesture and not exactly knowing when the response will come back. This is called Another Time piece. I also have quite a fascination with time, as you might be gathering from the titles of these works. And this one, as you can see, it was more of a gallery space. So this one bridges the kind of composition, installation, performance world a little bit more. All of these metal plates were wired together, again, as microphones and as speakers, and they were all brought just to the brink of feedback where they would start to kind of self-resonate and sustain themselves in that way. People coming in would influence the way that the plates would interact with one another, and they could kind of go up to them and touch them and stop the vibrations and kind of coax out different sounds and different vibration patterns from them, which was really interesting. All right, how are we doing? We're good. Okay, so this last thing is not one of my works, but I can't help but talk about it for a brief second. Just to make sure it's on everyone's radar, because it's so cool. The Sal-Mar construction. And I promise I'll link this in and make sure the threads are clear, although I think it'll be pretty evident why I'm including this. This is a composing machine that was invented by Sal Martirano in the late 1960s, 1970s, and some others. And what I find particularly interesting about this is that it is referred to as a composing machine. It looks a lot like an early, synthesizer. It has analog sound generation. It has digital logic circuits. It can spatialize. It can output up to 24 channels of spatialized audio. It's very interesting. But Sal Martirano referred to it as a composition. The entire thing, the object itself, was a composition from the moment that it first started making sound, through everything that it ever made to the moment that it stops making sound is part of the composition. And I've found this to be a little bit perplexing at first, but then also really, really fascinating. And it brings me to this question for everyone to ponder, which is, what is composition? And I know that's a huge question, and some of you might think it's really simple. At first, I thought it was really simple, and then I started to really carefully consider it. And I started to ask myself this question every time I would make a new work or set out to make a new project. And I realized that there's certainly not one answer for this. And the way that you decide to answer it can really lead you down some interesting paths. So for Sal Martirano with the Sal-Mar construction, this whole body of work is the composition, and it's a composition to generate compositions. I personally consider Migsy to be a composition in a similar way. And I think of that because I made decisions about what sensors were used and where they were placed and how they were scaled and what rules would be in place once that data hit the computer. How is it being parsed? All of these decisions about one-to-many relationships, right? All of that is not so different from deciding what melody write and what harmonies to use and things like that. Now, the interesting thing in a lot of my work, I think, is that the actual sound that emerges, or the actual sound that we hear, is often more of an emergent kind of spontaneous process that comes from this composition, which is typically the actual tools themselves, if that makes sense. So we often think about the composition as being the sound we hear, but I tend to think of it as the composition is like the code that we write, or the instrument that we build, or the environment that we establish, the rules that we create. And then the sound that we get to hear from that is more of an emergent kind of property. We can play it or run it 50 times, and we will probably get 50 completely different results. But they're still going to have that core identity of the structure, the piece, or the tools that you designed. I hope that makes sense. We can talk more about this in the questions if that didn't make sense. So when I was invited to compose a new piece for this dome, this was one of the first things that came into my mind was, what does that even mean? How do you compose for a dome? I mean, it's so fascinating to think about, composing for a space that is so large and so has so much intricacy in how you can spatialize sound. So it's just a question that I encourage everyone to maybe consider. So here are some initial thoughts of what I'm doing, having never written a note for dome. I don't know if dome has a name, but this is also a little nod to James Tenney, who I admire greatly. So I've never written for an ambisonic dome before. That's the truth. So what I've been doing is sort of similar to how I created the pieces that I showed you just earlier. Now, I'm working on building a kind of structure or an ecosystem that I can feed sounds into that will then kind of give me back, hopefully, something that is musically interesting. And then from that, I will kind of iterate and improvise with it and co-create ultimately what will become this piece, which will most likely be a fixed media electroacoustic piece that will be played in the dome. So when I was grappling with this idea of how do you write for a 10-meter wide dome that's such a big space, I immediately started to think about tiny spaces and impossible spaces, and how satisfying it would sound to be like inside the egg that's being cracked open, for example, or inside, and that probably sounds really gross, but just like that idea of hearing the cracking happening all around you. Or inside the tube of one of my trumpets that's changing length and having air flowing through it. These are kinds of sounds you never really get to hear. Inside a circuit that's being overdriven with feedback or something like that. Or a filter that's being pinged, or a low pass gate that's being pinged with no audio input. So this is the sound world that I've been collecting and playing with. And what I've been doing so far, so what I've been doing so far is basically collecting all of this sample material and sound material. And the reason why I was working primarily with sample materials because I was thinking to myself, I'm only going to be able to bring one bag on the airplane. So I can't bring all my synthesizers and trumpets. So I'm going to record some sounds, see how they sound in the dome, and then come back home and, develop these ideas out. So it was a little bit driven by practicality, which is sometimes how a lot of things happen. But I have this max patch, which I can share a little bit more about in a minute, which basically allows me to load all of these sounds that I've collected. So my sound world, I can load them in. And this patch is going to randomly choose which of the samples to play with each new kind of trigger that it receives. And it can choose up to 16 of them at once. And it can choose also to play the same one many different times with many different kind of appearances. So that's already in, kind of a co-creative aspect. I'm giving the sound materials and then I'm relinquishing control in terms of how it's actually going to happen. From there you can see, actually, I'm just going to close this out and open up the patch itself so that I can use my mouse to gesture around. Okay. So I think this should be a little better now. So from there, you can, I won't worry about this section for now, but the core of this patch is that it's a multi-tap delay. So you send a sound in, and then you can, have this delayed copies of the sound come back at you. And you can control the loudness of these 12 delay taps, which can create some really interesting kind of sensations of a sound coming at you, disappearing, and then coming back, things like that. The general panning, now this is just set up for stereo at the moment, but the panning of each of the delay taps. So whether the sound kind of starts in one corner and crosses over, or it ping pongs back and forth, or it does something in between, or anything else. And then some other parameters like the delay time and some reverb envelope and things like that. So this is really inspired by a modular synthesis workflow. If any of you are familiar with modular synths, you're probably seeing, oh yeah, right, she's got her envelope, the filter, there's the delay, it's all kind of modularized in that way. And yeah, that's basically what I've been playing around with. So in my home studio, I've been working with this in quad because that's what I have available. And I've been making recordings and just kind of dreaming about how it might translate into the dome. And generally, I don't know the answer to that, which is quite awesome. I have no idea. So I think, like most of the things I do, there's a strong initial concept, there's some strong initial research, and then everything changes as soon as you get to the place where you're actually implementing it and, putting it into action. But for now, let me turn this on and see if I can give you a little bit of sound. So you can, so again, the sound material is all like little tiny sounds, like little tube sounds, pinged filters, things like that. But it's really quite interesting what comes back from this process when you feed it in. And I've been listening to it and it's been giving me a lot of different ideas. And I think, oh, I now I have to go record these sounds, or, now I can capture this part, record this snippet, and then bring that into Reaper or something and work with it a little bit as a, a core piece of the composition. Oh, another important aspect of this that I didn't mention, this is really important actually, because I use a lot of randomness in various aspects of my patches pretty much all the time. Everything here that has a little red dot next to it can be randomized. So that's really important because, you can set up random panning trajectories in this, or random delay times, random envelopes, and then dial in the range of that randomness so that it doesn't immediately go from 0 to crazy. Because, a lot of people say, and it's very true, that sometimes when you just throw randomness at something, it just loses its original compositional intention and just goes crazy. So you can kind of always scale that a little bit to tone it down. a little bit, which can be helpful. So that is the quick kind of glimpse into what I've been doing. Let me come out of my screen share. And yeah, that's kind of the basics of what I've been doing for now. I think we're at a good point. If there's any questions or anything that we want to talk more about, we could do that. Thank you so much for being here and for joining me on Zoom and in YouTube world for those who are out there. I really appreciate it. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to talk more.
Thank you so much, Sarah. As you can see, perhaps on your screen, Robert has put his laptop out so you can see the dome, so you can feel like you're nearly here.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, there he is.
Almost within reach, right?
This is Garth's dome. Garth, does it have a name?
Well, I don't know. I wanted to call it Domey Dome Face because they had like an international prize for the best name for the new Antarctic exploring research vessel, and they called it Boaty Boat Face. So I thought we should have Domey Dome Face.
We have a question from Josh Oxford on YouTube. He's saying, can you get Max to send CV to the modular?
Yeah, I use an expert sleepers module called the ES8 or the ES9, which is an audio interface. So that's how I send control voltage to the modular. Yeah.
Right, and you can do that also over ADAT, right? So you can send like 8 channels of, yeah. Cool. So I'm keeping an eye on the chat here, but I do have a question for you. So that was fantastic. Thank you, and lots of rich ideas that I share with you in terms of thinking about what the composition is, and in fact, often with my composition students, we're spending a lot of time talking about the material, like sound as material, rather than as notes and harmony and counterpoint and so on, but actually as material and what the morphology of the material is. And so thinking about morphology and thinking about your idea of composition and some other ideas that you shared, time comes up, and you mentioned that you have an interest in time. Perhaps you could talk then a little about how time is reflected as a process of composition or as part of a composition, or perhaps I have a kind of slightly radical view, which is that it's not part of a composition at all, but that's a longer discussion. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I can't wait to have that conversation with you. That sounds so great. Yeah, so I think conceptually and abstractly, I'm very interested in time in like maybe a bit of a sci-fi kind of way. Like I like thinking about time travel and like all of those types of things. I think that musically or sonically, feedback is a really big thing for me that really like hits the time box for me in a really interesting way. And feedback doesn't just have to be Larsen effect feedback, like screaming speakers and microphones on stage and stuff like that when your microphone gets too close to your speaker. In this, this max patch that I just showed, there's a lot of feedback in the way that sounds are getting captured and then recaptured and kind of recontextualized and that kind of thing. I think another thing about time that's not necessarily as immediately audible that I play with a lot is feedback and also delays in the control domain rather than the audio domain. So displacing, again, I did talk about this a little bit, but displacing input gesture from output. And doing that in maybe a slightly unpredictable way. So working with nonlinear feedback to create a kind of chaotic structure internally, sending your input gesture into that. And then sometimes it does what you think it's going to do, and sometimes it makes it all turn purple. And you're like, wow, I have no idea why, but that's so great. For me, that's so great. So I think those are really the main things that I'm fascinated with in terms of time. I know that in music, when you say you're interested in time, it can mean a million things, like rhythm and meter and all of those things. But I'm really interested in kind of like capturing, and recycling moments and playing with folding nowness with past events and all of those types of things.
Yeah. And so can I ask just a follow-up question? And so what's the granularity of that idea of time? Because, in composition, and I too actually come from a classical background as a flute player. And so, often in music, we're thinking about a kind of linear sense of time. A piece starts and, goes at a certain tempo. And then we might look at open score works that have a less structured sense of when events happen. But it seems to me that we still often are really thinking about kind of state machines. That is, that we're just changing the period of time between when we're in one state or another state. Is there a way that you think about the division of those kind of hard boundaries?
That's a really interesting question. The division between different states. I wonder if I do think about that very much. I don't have an immediate answer, although some of the, I do have a strong interest in not starting and ending things. So for example, all of the pieces that I showed you, you couldn't gather this because I was dropping you into an excerpt of a video, but they did not have an obvious beginning or an end. The audience kind of came in, stayed some time, and then left. And I'm not exactly sure when that started as an interest, but I've always been really interested in the idea of a performance as kind of an experience that you kind of enter into and can linger with and come and go, and it will not be the same if you come and go a couple of times. I really am interested in long form, like gallery work that might be up for a month and might have one audio kind of evolution process that can unfold for the entire month, as opposed to repeating. I think that's really, really interesting as well. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the first thing that came to my mind.
We can talk about that more next month. Byron, did you have a question?
I do. So, thank you, Sarah. This has been really interesting. I've been looking forward to meeting you when you're out to visit. There were several things that struck me. One was certainly the materiality, and Garth was talking about that quite a bit. The other is, and you sort of touched on this as well a little bit. The sense of anticipation that really struck me when in the videos, particularly seeing you with your horn, and as a viewer, when you see you bring the horn up and you're ready to play, but you don't get the result when or even what you're expecting. So I wonder, do you give much thought to the audience expectation, and does the classical training, more traditional performance, play into any of that thought process for that?
Oh, interesting. Thanks for that question. So, okay, to be honest, I don't give a lot of consideration into how the audience in that regard, but there is something I can comment on that might be related, which is this idea of interaction. I feel like 90% of my compositional work is actually composing the interactions and really considering those. And then the rest kind of seems to kind of emerge from that in a pretty easy way once I've worked out those interactions. And there's a real so at the beginning, I used to do, and I think this is pretty common, a lot of one-to-one, very linear mappings. You know, I push a button, it makes a sound, it's reliable, it's repeatable, it happens, and it's a little bit boring for me. You know, I lose the interest pretty quickly. Or like I put my bell up and the sound goes up. I did all those kind of silly things and then was like, this isn't working. I need to come up with a little bit more of an interesting relationship. So then I went the whole other direction and I displaced everything in time, and I made every one input gesture equal 5 outputs. And it lost all the sense of kind of performative like embodiment that I had with playing an instrument that I had come to love and had practiced for decades. It was almost just like we were two completely different entities, not caring or listening to one another. So there's a fine line, and that's been a lot of the work over the last 10 years or so, is about balancing when there is that linear one-to-one control that's really reliable and when there isn't. And sometimes I will compose around that, and I will structure moments. And I think this gets to what you're asking, perhaps. I'll structure moments for myself and for the audience where it's very clear that there is a relationship, and I am doing something that's making something happen. And then I will let it go and kind of create this like push and pull and this ebb and flow of that control. I'm most creatively stimulated when it's not a one-to-one relationship, but I also understand that sometimes kind of balancing both can be really effective and really helpful. So.
Right. So it sounds like it comes back to that notion of co-creation and needing to have some independence of the structure you've defined.
Right. And I think in a real co-creative, relationship, both people do get to kind of nudge and control. And so when it was totally decoupled, I was losing my agency over the ability to say like, hey, let's go this way, like, hey, come over here and listen to me, or get a little quieter because I'm going to, take a solo or something. So it was all about balancing it. And I really like the idea that both people, or myself and my instrument, can say, I'll go with you. And then a next moment they can say, actually, I'm going to go against you now. And that creates a lot of interesting, kind of a more dynamic conversation, I think.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I have a question as well.
Hey.
I was wondering, first of all, thank you so much for your talk. It gave me just a lot to think about. So thank you. And I'm sorry you couldn't be here in person, but I'm glad you're planning to revisit us. What I was really interested in is thinking, you're talking a lot about time and space. And I noticed, the way your work is distributed spatially across the stage. I'm wondering, especially when you think of like a traditional trumpet performance, or single musician stands on stage, where's the audience, where's the performer? So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the three-dimensionality of the dome and how you expect or anticipate that will shape your work, particularly as it stands in relation to the audience and the audience kind of experience of it. Where will they be spatially? So that's kind of where my question is going, the three-dimensional aspect of your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So my honest answer is I really don't know until I get there, but I have maybe some guesses or something like that I can throw out there. You may have noticed that the couple of pieces I shared with you really are intentionally breaking away from that performer on the stage, audience, all in a group kind of approach. I've never really liked that for a lot of reasons, but a big one is that I've always been fascinated with the idea of spatial sound, although I have absolutely been exploring it in a much more like lo-fi, let's see what we can find at Home Depot kind of way than what you all have at your disposal there. But I've been interested in, so when we're thinking of a composition, we typically think, okay, I've got, what materials can I work with? I've got melody, I've got harmony, I've got, timbre, I've got orchestration, all of these things. And I have always been really interested in, how sounds are evolving over time, how they're moving in space, And the rhythms and the kinds of, quote unquote melodies or motives, they're not really melodies, but the kind of forms and gestures that you can create with those ideas. And there's a lot there. So I think that would be my answer, is that I would really be exploring the kinds of like musical phrases and motives that I can compose by the way that a sound travels across a room or across a space, as opposed to necessarily thinking about like the note as being the fundamental unit of sound. And like I'm creating intervals. It's really, I've got sounds as my fundamental units, and I'm kind of moving them around and creating a kind of counterpoint with their location in space. I don't know if that makes sense. These are very abstract thoughts at this point, having never written a note for Dome, but we will see. We will see how it all unfolds.
So our director, Pavan Taraga, says that we shall call the Dome the Dame, which is very, very theatrical. So the Dame. Yeah, another thing that I think you'll be really fascinated to experience is the kind of sense of material in the three-dimensional space, so that you can really allow the material to start above you and to settle into the space, and a kind of density and gravity comes with that transition, which can be quite subtle, but really affects you physically in the space.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. DAME stands for Dome of Arts, Media and Engineering. My God, people are so clever, aren't they?
That's perfect.
Yeah, there we go. So let's finish up with one question that we got on YouTube from Tony Ober. And Tony's a extraordinary modular synth musician here and teacher. And Tony asked, tools as composition, how do you think about ownership and authorship? And how do those fit into the kind of broader schema of your work?
Hi, Tony. It's nice to see you here. Thank you for being here. Ownership and authorship. Yeah, so I think I have a lot of thoughts about this. Let me see. So when I'm composing a piece, tools as composition. This is going to be hard for me to answer in a minute, but because co-creation is such a core part of my motivation in terms of making music and making instruments, I'm always thinking about that in my compositions and the tools and the software and everything else that I'm creating as well. So what I mean by that is I can't really recall if I've ever written a piece of music where I've said, here, it's by me and it will be played by you. There's always some aspect of responsibility that's required from the performer, whether they need to, for example, a great example could be if I gave this patch that I just showed to you and I said, you can perform this piece by putting your own sample material in. So there's another kind of co-creative thing there happening where I've created the compositional structure and the kind of, system. You put your own sound materials in. So now it's definitely not something that I have made on my own, and a new piece will emerge that we have kind of collectively worked on together. This is a really good question, and I think there's a lot to dig into there.
I think that we need to.
That's generally my initial thought.
I think we need to extend your stay in April for several weeks just in order to answer the questions that have come up today.
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. Thank you everyone they're deep and very thoughtful questions. Thank you.
So Sarah, our time has run out for today. I want to thank you very much for a fantastic talk. We're so excited to have you here in the near future. And lots of people I know are going to want to hang out and have a chat about some of the points that you've raised now. So in one way, your talk before you come is great because it seeds a bunch of questions ready for your arrival.
Great. I love it. I love it.
So thank you so much, and we greatly look forward to seeing you here in person in the very near
Thank you.
future.
Thank you all very much.